I honestly think this video is going to get more views just because I put the name gainstaging in the title. Like, it's such a powerful term when you just hear it online or when you hear it in conversation, but do people actually know what it means? Because once you hear what it means, you're going to say like, I can't believe it's that simple. I can't believe that that's all that it is. Because really, gainstaging, when it boils down to, even when you see it in a massive project like this, or when you're talking about gainstaging an individual plugin, everything that you're talking about is just making sure that the volume, the loudness, is equal going in and going out. So really, I can talk about all the different forms and things of gainstaging that I'm doing in this project, but all that it really boils down to is, I open up a plugin, I dial in the settings that I want to, I see if I like those settings, and once I like the settings, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the output here, and I'm going to set up the output so that it's equally loud as if the plugin wasn't there. That way, when I bypass the plugin, I can easily hear what the plugin is actually doing to the sound, as opposed to hearing any volume increases or decreases. Now, I guess that does mean that we have to, for just a little bit amount of time, talk about loudness and volume and all of the technical things behind it. Where I want to go here with is that it doesn't really matter which you use for gainstaging. That is what I want you to convince you. I know that technically speaking, using something like LUFS, which is a very accurate way of indicating the actual loudness of a sound, would be more accurate than using something, for example, like peak level. And that is because the peak level is the most instantaneous form of measuring the actual volume. It just looks at every individual sample and it picks the loudest one, and that is going to be the peak volume. Which, as you can imagine, if you take all of the volumes in an audio signal, which at a second is going to be 41,000 or 48,000, you can imagine that at least one of them is going to be fairly loud. At least one of them is going to be spiking out. But that doesn't mean that the whole file is going to be loud, that all of the samples are going to be loud. So really, that isn't a good measurement for loudness, for saying, okay, how loud do I actually hear this sound? Another example that you may have seen is when people use, for example, a very short impulse file together with a little bit of noise. I'm quickly inside of Ableton because that is where I have all of my sample libraries set up. And if I go in here, I should be able to find my own impulse file that I've created. Yes. My own impulse. And then I can probably also find some white noise. All right, here we go. We have two files. Let's get to here. Going to consolidate both this one and this one. Make sure they are at 0 dB and 0 dB. And what we're going to do is we're going to play both of them. And what I'll do for now is I'll subtract 10 dB from the noise, just for fun. So you would expect this impulse to be much louder than the noise. This is the impulse, and this is the noise. Which one sounds louder to you? I know that the impulse is technically peaking 10 decibels above the noise, because that is what we just set up. But yes, it does sound like the noise is at a higher volume, even though it technically is 10 dB lower in volume. So this is all very, very important for different parts of the mixing stage and also in mastering. And to be honest, in the whole form of music production, from the start of production up until the end of the mastering, all of this stuff is very, very important. But where it ironically isn't very important, in my opinion, is the precision with which you gain stage. And I think that is what gives people a lot of trouble with their gain staging, is that they think they need to be precise in their gain staging. So to actually see what I mean by that, let's have a look at this kick drum. In the project, it is this thing over here. And we're specifically going to look at the groove track in which the kick drum is contained. And what we're going to see is that we're going to get a certain peak volume readout here. Minus 14.2. That's okay. Now let's say that we're going to EQ this. And we're going to do that with this equalizer here. I'm going to hopefully be able to actually show the peak level while I'm doing this. Yes, you can see it here. Immediately shoots up. Then just a little bit of generic EQing. Honestly, this isn't a setting that I actually like, but I just want to add a little bit of EQ here. What we can see now is that we're at minus 10.8. We can reset this to see if there's maybe a change here. Yes, minus 12.4. The reason for that is because minus 10.8 is of course higher, and it always just keeps the higher numbers. So there was a higher number at some point, and then we changed the setting even more, which resulted in this peak level over here. So now what we need to do is we need to make sure that when we bypass this setting, we are not judging the increase and decrease in volume between the settings. So for example, right now, as you can hear, if I turn on the EQ, the kick becomes louder, and therefore it's becoming more prominent, it is becoming stronger, it is just more in your face, which is generally speaking a sound that we like. And therefore, if you had to decide on the difference between these two settings, I would always just choose the louder one. So the way that we're going to do that very roughly is we're just going to get the value that we had before, which is, I believe, minus 14.2. Yes, and we're going to reset this. Minus 12.4, meaning that in output we have to go down by 1.8. Minus 1.8, there we are. Minus 14.3, minus 14.2, that is going to be roughly the same. And again, I'm trying to make the argument that you don't have to be exactly the same. So now if we bypass it and we don't get that effect of the kick just becoming louder, we should be good. And as you can hear, now you can start to actually focus on the tonal changes that this EQ is making, as opposed to just the increase in volume, that being the thing that you like about the sound. And as you can imagine, this allows you to make much better decisions on what your plugin is actually doing, because when you set up a setting which makes the sound louder, you're eventually just going to compensate with the fader or somewhere else in the mix anyway. Like, it's not that you're going to get this free loudness from a plugin that is just going to make every sound much bigger and much fatter without you having to actually compensate for that effect in the actual mixdown. If you can imagine, if you make a kick drum much bigger and much louder and much more in your face, you're gonna have to either turn some other elements down to make space for that, or you have to go into turn down the kick drum again to make sure that it stays within the space that you've already allocated for it in your mixdown. So this really is what gate staging is all about. It is just making sure that whatever input gain you have, or whatever input level you have, is roughly the same as the output level, so that you can make these easy comparisons. And that is also true over a whole project. So for example, one of the things that I could do is I could try to gain stage some of these chains, specifically these ones that have multiple plugins in them. Of course, if you're in an individual plugin, just gate stage the plugin if you want to. Of course, if you have an individual plugin, gain stage the plugin over here. But gain staging an entire chain can also be useful, because we have this quick bypass over here, which means that I can directly with one knob be able to hear, okay, what are these plugins doing? Again, without being, covered by the actual volume increase or decrease of a sound, without that influencing the decision that I'm making. I can just hear, do I like the sound changes that these plugins are actually making to the sounds that I'm listening to, or do I just like the volume increase that we're getting? If you start gain staging that, then you're able to tell. Now, another thing that I'm absolutely not going to go into because I don't have any of it is how to treat analog gear. When it comes to analog gear and some of the plugins that have actually been created to faithfully emulate those analog units, you have to get into it with a certain volume. There you can say that also the input volume is important, and there you're also kind of gain staging the input volume. What that usually means is that the action that we're doing now once, we're just doing twice. We're making sure that, okay, we're going to go into the level of the plugin that it requires. Usually this is written somewhere in the manual, but it might also be just common knowledge among analog users. I am not one of them, as I said. So really, I don't know. And to be honest, I don't even care, because I don't plan on using analog ever. But if you are into that, you have to find out, okay, which level does the plugin or the actual analog unit that I'm using actually take? And at what volume, at what loudness does it work best? So that means that you're going to probably need to set some amount of gain, either going up or going down, before going into the unit, before going into the analog unit or the plugin that is emulating it. And then, as you can imagine, going out of that unit, you have to compensate for not just the actual increase or decrease in volume that now this analog thing is giving. It might also be a compressor, it might also be a distortion. Those things have a massive impact on the actual loudness of the sound, just like we saw with the EQ as well. So any of those things are going to change the loudness, and therefore you have to compensate for that. But you're also going to have to compensate for the input level changes that you made before going into the device. So really, that's gain staging. That is literally all there is. It is a tool or method that we use to make sure that the comparisons that we make between a setting and not having that setting actually means something significant in terms of judging just the tonality changes or the actual sound changes as opposed to the volume or loudness changes that a certain process is inducing in the sound. Now, finally, when it comes to gain staging, I do quickly want to say that most of the things that I do aren't gain stage. Like, I don't care enough about this boost and hearing what it exactly does to the sounds to maybe gain stage it. In this case, I did, but okay. But this one, for example, over here, this one is definitely cutting something, and it is definitely therefore either going to be quieter or louder. And if you're just asking yourself louder, yes, it can be louder. That has to do with how phase shift works and how EQs are actually implemented. Cutting in an EQ can actually make the sound louder. And that means that I most likely need to compensate here. I can also check that over here. You can probably already see that this is slightly louder than what we have over here. But honestly, this is negligible, I would say. Especially because, to be honest, I really only care about the sub-frequencies of this. So I just want to carve out a little bit of extra space, and I don't really care getting any of this volume back, or even to that extent, exactly getting the sub bass back at the position where it was before this EQ, because I was going to set the fader anyway. Like when it comes to gain staging, don't spend your time gain staging plugins that you're not going to compare anyway, because it's just about comparison. Just keep it for that. If you're not going to compare the plugin against not having the plugin, then just set up the plugin how you want to, maybe even use this fact of the increased or decreased volume to your advantage in the mix and allow you to, through the EQing, maybe make it sound slightly louder because it needs to be slightly louder in the mix. Like gain staging is a deliberate choice, but not gain staging is also, or at least can also be, a deliberate choice. Again, one of the interesting things about gain staging is that you can do it over a whole chain, and that would mean that you could potentially drive a certain plugin much harder than it was designed for, or that you would even want if it was the final plugin in a chain, because you're going to be able to turn it down anyway, right? Like if I have a distortion plugin, I want it to maybe distort a little bit more. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to massively turn up its input signal and then turn down its output. So really, that is everything that I want to talk about in terms of gain staging. I know that this is like a slightly mystical topic when it comes into mixing, but to be honest, I don't get why. I mean, if you don't know what gain staging is, then you may think of it like as something really, really important or really, really crucial to do for your mixes to succeed. But to be honest, just like any other tool, gain staging in and of itself is just a tool that we use to make sure that the process actually works as smoothly as possible. Like the mixing process, right? You making judgments about how the sounds sound. So that means that this is going to be the end for today's video. Let me know how you use gain staging in your mixes and in your productions as well by leaving a comment down below. And if you're there, make sure that you also like the video and are subscribed to the channel. Another way to support the channel is by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. Both of those things you can also find down below, one in the description box and one right next to the subscription box. Honestly, that may have been the funniest phrase in this whole recording session, and I hope that you made it this far. So thank you if you did. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.